in my database, which has 9,500 cases in it, I've counted the number of lashes and it's just shy of 2 million. The army absolutely loves to flog.
Flogging, a brutal punishment. But not that sort, you dirty bug. Oh, I'll grow up one day. This sort. We all know that the great Richard Sharpe was flogged, and so was his trusty sidekick Sergeant Harper. But how common was it in the British Army during the Napoleonic era? Zack White is probably the expert on the subject. He's just finished his PhD and he runs the Napoleonic Wars podcast. In today's film, he explains everything you ever wanted to know about flogging. He started off by explaining what sort of crimes led to flogging and how many lashes could be given.
So let's start with desertion because it's the most common one. With all of these things, it's a sliding scale. So there's a theoretical legal maximum, and then you've also got to bear in mind there are different levels of court within this system, and that has an impact because the lowest court is the regimental courts martial. That can only issue 500 lashes up until 1812, and then the Duke of York turns around and issues this order saying you're not issuing more than 300. Then at the top, you've got the general courts martial that does the most serious crimes, particularly your mutinies and your desertions. And flogging, the theoretical maximum there is 1,500 lashes. Now, what I will say is I've never seen it sentenced. No, that's not true. I've seen it sentenced on 3 occasions, and every single time the king steps in and says, no, you're not doing that. Partly because in 1807, the king issues this basically piece of advice saying, look, in my considered opinion, 1,000 lashes is quite enough. And you still think 1,000 lashes? But it's interesting. The king expresses that opinion, and yet he gets ignored. On several occasions, 1,200 lashes is issued, and I've seen that inflicted, at least according to the records. So flogging was definitely a key part of this.
So how did floggings actually happen? What were the logistics of them, and what was the theatre, the spectacle like?
Everybody loves a flogging in a sort of weird kind of way. We don't love a flogging, but we do love a flogging. Shall we start with what this will do to you? Because this is a big debate, and everybody turns around to me and they say, oh, 1,500 lashes, 1,000 lashes, that's going to kill a man, right? I'm not so sure, and I'm not a defender of flogging. I will be the first to tell you that in my database, which has 9,500 cases in it, I've counted the number of lashes, and it's just shy of 2 million. The army absolutely loves to flog. There's no getting away from that. Now, just because the army issues 2 million lashes doesn't mean that it inflicts 2 million lashes. And so this is where the whole pragmatism element comes in. But in terms of the process, so the first thing you do is you parade the unit. Flogging is meant to be public. And you've got to bear in mind that's consistent with society. Hangings are public. People go to watch a hanging and people hand out last speeches and little mementos of the occasion. There's a whole business around that. So there is a lot of brutality in this system. And you parade the regiment because the reason you're punishing this guy, the reason you're flogging him, isn't just to send a message to him. It's to reinforce this message that, look, there's a law. And if you don't stick to the law, this is what happens to you. And remember that. So sure, the public spectacle element is absolutely embedded in it. You parade the regiment, you then bring the accused in, and then you read the proceedings of the court martial. And this is really important in terms of saying, look, this is what isn't okay. You go through, this is the charge. This was the evidence. You can quite clearly see that this person was guilty. The officers came to this conclusion and they are giving you this punishment. And that helps to establish legitimacy. It kind of takes us away from this idea that if the officer didn't like you, he'd just casually have you strung up for a couple of hundred lashes. And that's where this whole capricious and arbitrary argument starts to fall apart, because there is a process. And the only way in which you can start to flog is if you adhere to this process. And there are checks and balances. The general courts martial have to be reviewed either by Wellington or by the commander-in-chief back in London. And if they go to the commander-in-chief back in London, they then have to go to the king or the prince regent. So there is this whole process that is very much focused on making sure that the law is applied in a legal way. How does the process work? Well, then once you're paraded, you've had the proceedings read, you're told to take your shirt off, and then up steps the drummer boy. Now, this is where the big debates come in terms of differences between army and navy, because everybody says, well, look, the navy issues dozens of lashes rather than hundreds of lashes. So the army will issue 100, 200, and sometimes, multiples of 50, but generally it's big numbers. The navy, it's 1 dozen, 2 dozen, 3 dozen. And that's where people kind of go, well, look, the navy's more lenient. And this is where I'm not entirely sure, because for pretty obvious reasons, nobody's gone and got nerdy about types of whip and impact of a different whip on a body versus another. You need to get sort of ballistics dummies and all the rest of it to do this. And I think we've probably got better things to do with our lives than start beating up ballistic dummies.
Enough, I say! I think the lesson is well taken.
But what I see when I go to different museums is different styles of whip. And this is going to sound really weird to people, so apologies. Please try not to be like freaked out by this whole thing. Believe me, I've heard all of the jokes about me and my fixation with whips. So you don't need to post them in the comments, folks. But when you go to Portsmouth dockyards, for example, you can see 2 different styles of the cat of nine tails whip on display. One has tarred flails to it. So that would very obviously wreak havoc on your body. If you then look very carefully on HMS Victory, you will see that there is a punishment section on one of the decks where people could be chained up, but also where they hang. An example of a cat of nine tails whip, which is much more typical of what we associate with it. So it has knotted cords to it. That's a very big affair. It's probably about 4 foot long in total, so it would have a lot of weight to it if you swung it, and it would be swung by the boatswain, so the burliest member of the ship. And you've also got to consider the materials. So the one on Victory is kind of twine. It's knotted twine. It's a very kind of robust, it's not kind of spindly string. It's very robust in its nature. If you go into the Guards Museum in London, they have an example of a cat and nine tails whip, which was physically used. In fact, if you look very carefully, you can see little darkish sort of brown-red splodges on it, which are probably indicative of residual blood stains. So a gory piece of equipment. Now that's a much, much smaller affair. That's about 2 feet long at most, and including the handle. And the threads on it are basically knotted string. So it's nowhere near as burly as what you can see in the Navy. So we don't really know what the answers are from that, other than to say that if the example in the Guards Museum was standard in the Army, actually there's this big discrepancy in terms of what each individual lash physically represents in terms of damage to the body. So that's your nerdy kind of discussion of what's going to happen. The one thing I will say is the Army has the facility to kill its men. So those who turn around and say, oh, well, the Army is just trying to flog its men to death. No, it's really not, because the whole reason that you flog somebody rather than shoot them is that you don't want to remove that individual from your unit. You're flogging them to send that public example saying, look, we will inflict this punishment on you, and then you will go back into your community. You will go back into your regiment. The Army can't afford to be flogging its men to death. Think about the illness stats. About a third of Wellington's force is on sick leave at any point in time. He can't afford to be sending more men permanently to the hospitals because they've had their back ripped to shreds and there's no way they're going to be able to serve again. These soldiers need to be able to return to their unit, carry their pack, and march in a few days' time. So I don't believe that it is about just the brutality. Yes, it's about sending that message, and that's really important. This is meant to be about deterrence. But yeah, there's this ongoing question about flogging, and are you going to stop this practice? And it's really interesting that even people like William Wilberforce, who we all know from his association with slavery, one of the leading humanitarians of this period, turns around when the debates are happening in Parliament about flogging and says, I'm not sure it's practical to get rid of it right now. So there just isn't this same attitude back then that we have to the practice now.
So who administered the floggings? One of my areas of interest is the Victorian era, and I know that so-called drummer boys were usually actually fully grown men. Was that the case here?
It absolutely is. So Eamon O'Keefe's done some great work on this in kind of dispelling that myth. We're not talking about sort of 8, 9, 10, 12-year-olds. We're talking people in their mid to late teens, early 20s in terms of age. So again, it's about these kind of balances. A 17-year-old, an 18-year-old has a lot of weight behind them. They might not be a bosun in their mid 20s who has just built like an absolute tank. But these are not kind of little kids that are made to do this. These are young adults, put it that way.
And would there be pressure on them to like dish out a good beating? Like, because presumably, these people often, so their instinct would probably be to hold back. Would there be a lot of pressure on them not to do that? Would they be under close scrutiny?
Absolutely, they would. And they get rotated as well. So every 25 lashes, you flick to another one, and then they continue the punishment. And partly that's about making sure that, if you've got 1,000 lash punishment, that the last 500 lashes are as severe as the first 500 due to the tiredness of the person inflicting them. So yeah, it's a kind of a collective thing. It's almost like a family affair. And they don't have a choice in it. You're given the order to flog. If you don't, well, that's disobedience, which means you can be tried, probably before a regimental court-martial, and you yourself can be flogged.
And then let's say all of the strokes have been given, it's finished. What then happens to the man? Does he have some sort of medical care generally? What's the situation afterwards?
Pint of best rum, half and half. Half in your belly and half in your back.
This is a bit of a murky area. We're not massively clear on what happens. There don't seem to be a lot of indications of people then being taken straight to the local casualty clearing station or the local hospital and receiving treatment. It seems to have been done much more within the regiment, which again sort of implies that horrendous, yes, but what you're probably dealing with is a bleeding back rather than, the all of the flesh being stripped from somebody's back. It seems as though there was a tendency to get it dealt with partly by battalions' wives. You might bind the wound, deal with any bleeding, obviously, because inevitably it's going to cause bleeding.
From your research, what was the response to these punishments, such as flagging? If you could give us a sort of brief overview, were the officers and men in favour, or was it very much frowned upon and disliked?
Yeah, it's a known deterrent. You also get this kind of culture of plunder for reward, which is also kind of key within all of this. So there are times when officers will say, you can now go and plunder. So in the morning before the Battle of Waterloo, General Adams allegedly turns around to some soldiers and said, look, you've been on duty all night. You've done a brilliant job. There are 3 farmhouses. Be back here in an hour. And so, this creates this really kind of blurred distinction. You also get people who turn around and say, look, the commissariat can't feed you. There's a garden full of vegetables. Have at it, gents, sort of thing. So officers don't love a flogging. You get sadistic gits, of course you do. But those ones are the ones who are quite often weeded out in the process, because in the 6-monthly inspection reports, generals would turn around and say, this army, this regiment is using flogging too much. You need to find other ways to instill discipline. So it's not as though everybody's wedded to the lash, but the figures are eye-watering. 2 million says it all. And that's not even across all of the cases in the army. That's just the 9,500 that I've looked at. There's probably another third still to add on to that. But yeah, being overly brutal destroys a regiment, destroys its morale. The other thing to throw into this mix is the practice of fragging. This is the idea that if you are too sadistic, you're too brutal, when it comes to a battle, you might find that you end up with a bullet in the back of your head, courtesy of your own men. So it's not as though the officers fear the men, but they know that this is a relationship. You've got to command, not simply beat these people into submission.
And just quickly, the men themselves, have you come across much evidence that they thought it was actually a good thing, or is it generally hated?
It's not liked. Nobody likes to witness a flogging, but it goes back to what I was saying earlier, this idea that there needs to be a deterrent for the worst individuals, and this recognition that by and large, the officers can be trusted in terms of how they wield this. There is going to be this sort of slightly fatalistic attitude, isn't there? This is a society that has public executions. They're going to be used to a more brutal treatment, just generally. But because bear in mind, they get the rules read to them, I think it's every month. It's either every month or every other month on parade. And that's written into law, that the rules, the legal stipulations have to be outlined to them. And that in turn means that they know where these boundaries are. So they know they're playing a dangerous game. And if they can trust the officer, then actually it doesn't matter quite so much what the law says. What matters is that bond with the officer. And that then dictates this whole relationship and the practical implementation of law, because then you can say, okay, look, if I really overstep the mark, then yes, I am going to be punished. But if I'm smart enough to not take this too far, there's that flexibility in that relationship, which means that this system is practical rather than sort of exactly applied in terms of the letter of the law.
Okay, guys, there you have it. Zack's going to be back on the show again shortly. He's going to explain to us what happened to officers who got in trouble. How were they punished? Were they flogged? If you want to know the answer to that, then hit that notification bell. Be sure to subscribe.